Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Tonight, we dive into the chilling true stories of the USS Hornet, one of the most haunted ships in the world. From ghostly sailors to restless spirits, these 5 terrifying tales will leave you questioning what's real. We want to hear from you. Have you ever encountered a ghost or felt a presence you couldn't explain? Share your stories in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more spine-tingling content. Let's uncover the truth behind the paranormal together. Midnight on the Hornet, the USS Hornet creaked and groaned beneath my feet, a metal giant stirring from slumber. The soft rumble of waves pounding against the hull was the only sound breaking the heavy stillness. I checked my watch. 11:58 p.m. At midnight, our ghost hunt at night would officially begin. I had never been one to believe things, but when my friends suggested that we overnight on the so-called haunted aircraft carrier, I couldn't resist taking on the challenge. Now, stuck in a dimly lit hallway alone, I was beginning to regret my pride. The history of the ship hung heavy in the air. Dozens of lives lost, souls stuck between worlds. Or at least that's what the rumors said. I shook my head, attempting to shake off the growing unease. It was just an old vessel, nothing special. My flashlight danced, its beam fluttering for a moment before settling. I had a chill run down my spine as I noticed how utterly isolated I was. My friends had fanned out to cover more ground, and I was left to cover the lower decks. As the clock hands of my watch crept over into the new midnight, a low thrum vibrated the ship. I'd think at first that it was simply the increasing tightness in my head, but it swelled louder, more insistent. It wasn't machinery, it was more the sound of chanting. I pressed on, my footsteps echoing hollowly as I descended into the bowels of the Hornet. The air grew denser and pungent with the scent of oil and sea salt. My beam of light danced off corroded pipes and frayed caution signs, shooting long shadows away in seemingly solitary directions. A metallic crash behind me had me twirling around, thudding heart. Nothing. Just deserted corridor disappearing off into darkness. I laughed anxiously, reprimanding myself for being such a wimp. But turning around, I came to an abrupt halt. Standing there at the end of the corridor, back in deep shadow, was a figure. It was nothing more than a dark shape, yet unmistakably human. I had no time to yell before it vanished behind a bend. Against my better judgment, I trailed behind. "Hello," I called out, my voice small and weak in the huge empty spaces of the ship. No reply. I turned the corner and stood in what looked to be an old mess hall. There were rows of tables ahead of me, the tops covered in a heavy dusting of dirt. When my flashlight swept across the space, something caught my attention. One chair, pulled out from a table as if someone had recently gotten up. The hum I had heard previously grew louder here, sounding almost like music. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I crept cautiously toward the chair, half expecting that someone would suddenly materialize in it at any moment. As I reached out to touch it, a cacophonous scream of metal ripping against metal shook the air. I recoiled, palms shielding my ears. After the din had faded away, I realized that all the chairs in the room were then being pulled away from under the tables. My heart racing, I turned to leave, and found my way blocked by a patch of fog that had not previously existed. Horror seized my throat as I searched frantically for another way out. That's when I saw them. Dozens of men emerging out of the mist. They were attired in naval uniforms from all eras, their faces impossibly gaunt and unreadable. They moved more than walked toward me with an inhuman facility. I backed away until I hit a wall, my lungs heaving in ragged gasps. The ghost sailors moved closer, their blank eyes on me. One of them advanced, an officer by the insignia on his uniform, and opened his lips as if to speak. But rather than words, an avalanche of water burst forth. It splashed against my ankles, icy cold and smelling of death. The other ghosts copied it, water gushing out of their mouths in impossible quantities. The room was filling up in seconds. The water rolled up quickly, swirling around my ankles, my knees. I clawed at the walls, frantically for a handhold, anything to stay above water. No sooner had the water reached my chest than everything went black. The water, the mess hall, the spirits, all were gone in an instant. I stood again in the corridor where I had started, gasping and soaking wet. I was shaken but insisted on seeking a rational explanation and returned to the main deck. I needed to locate my friends to make sure that I wasn't losing my mind. When I emerged onto the flight deck, the sight that greeted my gaze took the breath from my chest. The sky above was ablaze with unearthly light, waltzing drapes of green and blue undulating above the stars. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, and utterly impossible. We were outside the latitudes where the aurora borealis was theoretically to be seen. "Guys?" I called out, shaking. "Do you see this?" No answer came. The flight deck stretched out before me, ominously empty. Where were my friends? Where was everyone? A movement had caught my attention, a single figure at the far end of the flight deck. Relief flooded through me as I saw Sarah's outline. I rushed towards her, calling out her name. She didn't glance back, didn't even turn around. When I was getting close, I noticed that something was not right. She was standing too rigidly, her stillness unnatural. "Sarah?" I whispered as I caught up beside her. Ever so slowly, she turned my way. I took a step back in terror. Sarah's face was frozen in a silent scream of fear, her eyes wide and glassy as they stared at something I couldn't see. She was gone before I could react, dissolving into dust before my eyes on an unseen wind. A wail accumulated in my throat, but perched up before I could release it. More and more of the people around me kept showing up. The remaining of my friends, the naval uniformed strangers, the faces that I'd only seen on the photos of the crew of the Hornet. They each individually appeared before me with the same scared face before withering to emptiness. The world started to whirl around me as I backed away, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. This couldn't happen. It must be a delusion, a dream, anything but reality. I ran until my lungs felt like burning embers and my legs ached to fold up. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get out. Corridors blurred past me, each one looking exactly the same as the last. Was I running in circles? Had the layout of the ship shifted? Finally, exhausted and bewildered, I collapsed against a wall. Choking for air, I was aware of a sound, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Footsteps, hundreds of them, marching in flawless unison. They were all around me, closing in. Panic fueled a new burst of energy, and I shoved away from the wall and ran again. But regardless of how hard I ran, the footsteps followed. I turned and skidded to a stop. There in front of me were rows and rows of ghostly sailors. Their uniforms were decades of sea duty, from World War II to the current time. All were at attention, eyes fixed straight ahead as if waiting for orders. They walked toward me together, standing in front of me. Their eyes flashed with an otherworldly intensity, holding me immobile. I needed to run, to scream, to wake up from this horror, but I was stuck there, paralyzed with terror and a sense of irreparable fate. The spirits parted, forming a path to one solitary figure standing alone from the rest. I stood frozen, unable to look away as the figure approached me. It was dressed in an admiral's uniform, its face shrouded in darkness beneath its cap. When it spoke, it used the voice of a chorus of thousands, echoing with the heaviness of history and the cries of the lost. "Welcome aboard, recruit. Your tour of duty begins now." The admiral reached up and removed its cap. I stared in stunned wonder at the face that was revealed underneath. My own face, grown old beyond recognition, eyes full of the same ghostly light as the others. What had hit me was beyond understanding. One night was more than one. One night was equal to eternity. I had been here forever, would be here forever, doomed to repeat, time and again, the infinite cycle of fear and discovery. As this reality sank into my structure, I was changed. I was light as air, my legs lifting off the deck. Other ghosts surged around me, welcoming me among their ranks with silent nodding of heads. The last I knew before surrendering to this new reality was the world beyond the Hornet. The pier, the city lights, all vanishing like a desert mirage. In their stead, an endless ocean stretched out in all directions, the ship cutting on through seas of time and memory. I had come in search of specters, not knowing that I would become one myself. Tonight, when the midnight bell rings forever on the USS Hornet, I am among the ghostly crew, doomed to be glued to the ship of dead men, forever waiting for the next unsuspecting one to be joined to our ranks. For on the Hornet, duty is never complete and watch is never ended. We are guardians of lost histories, keepers of unspoken pasts, and with the spectral aurora pirouetting above, we drift on through the blackness, forever searching, forever remembering, forever haunting. The Eternal Watch. I shouldn't have been there. I knew that the moment I stepped onto the USS Hornet. The air was thick with a kind of heaviness, like I'd walked into a room where something terrible had just happened. I rationalized that it was my mind playing games with me, that the myths were getting to me. Ghost stories are kid stuff, aren't they? But as I ascended the gangway, I couldn't help but get the feeling that I was under observation. The ship was a maze of steel corridors and steep stairs, each one colder than the last. The tour guide's voice was a muffled echo, but I had fallen behind. I wasn't in the mood for the rehearsed history lesson or the sanitized tales of Apollo 11. No, I was here for something else, something personal. I hadn't stepped foot on the Hornet since I served in the Navy, and even then, I was only on her briefly before she was decommissioned. But it wasn't nostalgia that brought me back. It was him, Jack, my brother in arms, my best friend, the man who watched my six until the day he failed to do so. Jack died on this ship, and I never had the chance to bid him farewell. They explained to me it was an accident, a slip on a slippery deck during the height of a storm. But I never believed so. Jack was too steady, too careful for something as mundane as that to do him in. And yet there it was, an official certificate, a folded flag, and a hole in my chest that never did fill. I wandered deeper into the ship, further away from the rest and their flashlights. The dim red glow of the emergency lights sent spindly shadows across the walls, and any creak of the aged metal made me start. My own footfalls echoed loudly in the quiet, as though the ship itself was echoing them to inform me that I was not alone. I was on one of the lower decks, near the engine room where Jack had labored. The air here was not the same, thicker, colder. My breath puffed out in small puffs even though it wasn't all that cold outside. That's when I heard it, a faint tap-tap noise coming from down the corridor. Tap, 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 tap. It was Morse code. Jack had a habit of playing pranks on Morse code, pounding out trash messages just to see if anyone would respond. My heart started pounding as I followed the sound, my mind full of memories of all-night vigils and Jack's stupid grin as he pounded jokes on his wrench. The knocking led me to a dusty old storage area with a heavy steel door that groaned when I pushed it open. It was black as coal inside, except for one faint light bulb suspended from the ceiling. It smelled of rust and oil and something else, something metallic and sour that made me ill. "Jack," I breathed before I could stop myself. My own voice was small and silly in the choking silence. But then something answered me. It wasn't a sound exactly, more of a feeling, a pressure in my chest that it was hard to breathe under. The light bulb started swinging more frantically now, casting wild shadows across the walls. And then I saw him, or at least I think I did. A man stood across the room, faintly lit but unmistakably human-shaped. He was in navy blues, his cap at a rakish angle, just as Jack had when he was on leave. My heart leapt up into my throat as I moved forward. "Jack? Jack, is that you?" My voice cracked. The body didn't stir at first, but just stood there rigid like a statuary cut from darkness. And then his head canted fractionally to the left, and swear I could almost hear him whisper laughter into himself. "Been waiting for you," he declared. Or maybe wasn't quite so much of a declaration to the outer senses. Maybe something that just rattled inside the walls of my own head. I stood frozen as he advanced on me, his movements slow and careful as though he were testing out his legs after a long time of being idle. When he entered the light, my stomach dropped. He seemed to be Jack, or what Jack might have seemed had he been pulled from a grave where 20 years had spent him submerged underwater. His skin was bloated and pale, his eyes deep set in their sockets but yet faintly gleaming with some unnatural light. "You abandoned me," he said, or thought, or imposed himself upon my brain. I no longer could tell. No, I stammered, recoiling instinctively even though the entire me ached to rush toward him and wrap him and apologize simultaneously. You left me behind, he repeated louder this time, and angrier too. The door crashed shut behind me with a ringing clang that vibrated through my head like gunfire. Fine, I didn't know. I wailed back hysterically with tears streaming down my face, not just from fear, but also for guilt, because in my heart possibly he was right. Possibly I had left him behind somehow. Albeit, if only in essence. The air grew cooler still until the frost began creeping onto the walls about us, and then suddenly all went black again, save for those bright eyes staring straight through me like two searchlights cutting through foggy waters at midnight. And then he came charging, or drifting, or something, straight for me faster than any man is supposed to move, and all went black. When I awoke, or at least I woke up, I thought, exactly where I wasn't in that storage room anymore, but rather on deck, standing watch, under starry night skies just like the good old days. But something was off. Very, very off. The stars weren't right. They were too damn bright somehow. And there weren't any other crew members anywhere. Not even distant voices or sounds of footsteps echoing through empty corridors. And then realization slapped me in the face like a bucket of cold seawater spilled overboard. This isn't real. But before panic could fully take hold again, I heard another familiar voice behind me, speaking calmly but firmly. Time for your shift. Slowly turning around, I saw Jack standing there looking perfectly normal now, as if nothing had ever happened, as if none of this had ever happened. Except for one small detail, his eyes still glowed faintly greenish yellow beneath his cap's brim, as if some part of whatever that thing was still lingered within him. And worst part? Looking down at myself, I saw my own eyes were beginning to glow faintly too. The ghosts of command. The odor was the first thing that struck me upon entering the Admiral's conference room. It was not the usual stale scent of old ships or the faint tang of oil and seawater that filled the USS Hornet. No, this was different. Tartar, metallic, like blood that had been exposed too long to the air. I had no right being there. The room was roped off, a remnant left intact for tourists who wanted to glimpse the ship's storied past. But I wasn't a tourist. I wasn't here for history or nostalgia. I was here because I'd heard the rumors, the whispers about what happened in this room after the sun went down and no one else was looking. The ship was quiet now, hours after visiting hours. My shoes echoed off the cold steel floor as I walked across the entrance, ducking under the velvet rope with a feeling of dread and yet daring. The room was just as I'd imagined it. A big table with chairs neatly arranged around it, papers and maps pinned to the walls, and a rotary phone looming ominously at one end of the table. I sat down in one of the chairs, its cold leather nipping at my back as I tried to slow down my breathing. The air here was heavier, pushing down on me like an invisible weight. I told myself it was nerves, that I'd spooked myself with too many ghost stories at midnight. But I knew better. Deep down, the first sign came almost immediately, a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I thought at first that it might be the ship settling, or maybe machinery far off still running below decks. But it grew louder, more distinct, until it was clear that whatever it wasn't mechanical. It was voices, low and muffled, like a heated argument being conducted just out of earshot. I stood up slowly, my chair creaking against the floor with a sound that made me wince. The voices stopped talking at once, and instead of them was a silence so profound it felt deafening. My eyes searched the room for something that was out of place, but everything was exactly as it had been when I entered, except for one thing. The rotary phone at the other end of the table was off the hook. I hadn't touched it, I was sure of that, but there it was, hanging slightly over the edge of the table, as if someone had just picked it up and slammed it back down again in anger. My heart racing, I approached it cautiously, half expecting it to ring at any moment. It didn't ring. But something did occur. The maps on the walls began to flutter as though they'd been hit by a burst of wind, though there was not so much as a vent in the sealed-off room. Papers dropped off the table and onto the ground in slow motion, their edges curling like they were alive. And then the footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere just outside the room. They grew louder with each passing moment until they stopped right outside the door. I held my breath as I stared at the handle, waiting for it to turn, but it didn't move. Instead, there was a knock, 3 sharp raps that sent shivers running down my spine. I didn't answer, not out loud, anyway, but some part of me must have given assent because the door creaked open of its own accord. There was no one there. But then they appeared. They were shadows initially, dark pools on the ground that stretched into vaguely human shapes. They materialized one at a time. Men in crisp uniforms with medals that glowed dully on their chests and caps that rested immaculately on their heads. Their faces were pallid and expressionless, their eyes empty voids that seemed to suck all light from the room. They entered the room silently, sitting down at the table as if summoned together for some long-expected meeting. My legs felt heavy as I stepped back farther toward the other wall, my heart pounding so fiercely I feared they might hear it. One of them, the tallest, turned his head in my direction slowly, his empty gaze fastening onto mine. "Sit," he said, or rather ordered, in a voice that was so cold and empty it felt like I was having shards of ice shoveled into my ears. Despite every instinct I had to do the opposite, I sat. The moment I was seated again, they began speaking, not to me but to each other, in voices that wrapped around and overlapped like a chorus of whispers on a winter wind. Failure, betrayal, disobeyed orders. Their sentences were disjointed but threaded with anger and blame, and something more, regret. I understood then that these weren't merely ghosts. They were commanders from decades ago who had made choices that lost thousands of lives in wartime action aboard this very ship. And now they were replaying those instants again and again in some eternal court where no judgment could ever be rendered. And yet something changed. Their attention pivoted back to me, and I was not just a spectator anymore. "You?" one of them snarled, a grizzled warrior with deep scars etched in his face, his voice contemptuous. "You abandoned your post." My blood ran cold as memories from years past came flooding back. Memories I'd buried deep because facing them was too much to endure. It was during my brief time on this ship, a routine drill that turned fatal, a fire sweeping the lower deck as chaos erupted all around us. And I, instead of battling flames alongside my fellow crew members, I'd panicked and fled above deck while others stayed behind, including him, Lieutenant Commander Harris, the same man who'd rescued me from wreckage and training exercise months before, and who died saving others while I cowered above deck. "You left us," Harris's ghostly form said now, his voice not with anger, but disappointment so profound it shattered something inside me. Face streamed with tears uncontrollably, but before could manage any words in reply. The lights lurched wildly, and everything dissolved in a blinding white light. When finally opened eyes again, wasn't alone anymore. Standing directly behind mirror reflection opposite wall, stood Harris himself, not ghostly apparition anymore, but flesh and blood reality staring back accusingly. Until reflection wasn't entirely his either. It was mine, grotesquely blending together, horrifying realization dawning at the same time. This wasn't haunted punishment. It was judgment. And the verdict? Eternal damnation, reliving the worst moment of life for eternity, aboard the cursed ship, never truly releasing sins of the past, mistakes determining the future fate, sealed forevermore. The Lost Pilot. The first time I heard the sound, I thought it was the wind. A mournful whistle that wrapped its way through the USS Hornet's seemingly endless corridors. But as I stayed there in the lower deck gloom, I knew that it wasn't the wind at all. It was a voice. It started softly, almost inaudible, as if a voice whispered just out of reach. I strained to listen, my heart pounding, as I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then it rose, clearer, until I could make out the words, "Help me, please." I froze. The voice sounded as if it was coming from down the hallway before me, far in the blackness of the underside of the ship. I was alone here, later at night, seeking some ghostly vision. The Hornet was said to be haunted, and I'd always been a skeptic until tonight. I ought to have returned then and there. All my intuition was yelling at me to leave, to turn back up the gangway and never again look that way. But curiosity tends to prevail over fear, and unwillingly, I moved forward. The corridor stretched on seemingly forever, the gentle whir of emergency lighting casting ghoulish shadows that danced with the creaking of the ancient hull. With each step, the air cooled, heavy with the smell of rust and sea salt. My flashlight flickered once, twice, before shutting down completely, leaving me stumbling in almost blindness. It was then I heard it for the second time, this time closer. "Help me." The voice was reedy and strangled, as though the man was gagging on his own breath. My fingers shook as I wrestled with the flashlight, pounding it against my palm until it coughed back into existence. The beam cut through the darkness, shining down on an old hatch at the opposite end of the corridor. It was ever so minutely ajar, just sufficient for something, or someone, to wriggle through. My pulse was racing as I approached it, every step sounding like a gunshot in the silence. I hesitated before the hatch, and then opened it with trembling fingers. The other room was small and cramped, filled with rusty equipment and broken machinery that hadn't been moved in years. The air was colder in here, biting at my skin as my breath misted in front of me. And then I saw him. He was sitting in the corner of the room, his back to me, dressed in an old flight suit that looked like it came from a museum. His head fell forward, his shoulders slumped over as if the weight of the world was on them. "Are you all right?" I asked tentatively, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer at first, didn't even stir. But then his head canted very slightly in my direction. It was then I realized something was amiss. Awfully wrong. His neck extended too far, twisting at an incorrect angle until his face was visible. His skin was waxen and pale, his eyes deep set in their sockets but wide and staring at me. His mouth hung loose, lips cracked and dry as if he had not spoken in years, or breathed for that matter. "Help me," he had spoken again, but this time his voice wasn't in his mouth. It was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, reverberating off the walls like some sort of heavenly din. I retreated, stumbling over a piece of wreckage and falling to the cold metal floor. My flashlight fell from my grasp and slid away from me, its beam casting frantic shadows around the room as it came to rest. When I looked up again, he was looming over me, his actions stiff and jerky like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. His eyes locked into mine as he reached out with a hand that was less flesh than bone. "Help me," he repeated, and this time there was no question in the desperation of his voice. I sprang to my feet and ran out of the room without looking back. My chest was pounding, and my heart was racing as I stumbled blindly through the ship's confusing corridors, every shadow seeming to reach out for me as I passed. No matter how quickly or how long I ran, however, I could not shake him. My own footsteps reverberated back behind me, the heavy boots clomping against the metal decking with impeccable synchrony to my desperate stride. "Help me," his voice called again, and this time it was a bit closer than last. I turned sharply and crashed into a solid object, a door labeled Flight Deck Access. Without giving a moment's consideration to where it would lead or what would be on the other side, I flung it open and stumbled through. The cold night air hit me like a slap across face, as did sudden realization that somehow I'd made way back up topside without even realizing it. But relief quickly gave way dread when saw what lay ahead. There, in center flight deck, illuminated only by pale moonlight, stood figure wearing same tattered flight suit and holding something glinting faintly silver against chest. As I approached quietly, I knew what he held in his possession wasn't gun, but rather helmet with scuffed down insignias on it, marking him World War II era pilot. And then suddenly, everything fell into place. This wasn't just ghost haunting random lost warship generation. This was Ghost trying desperately to regain stolen eons ago. His existence. Before I could reply further, however, he turned slowly towards horizon above and let out blood-ricocheting scream like nothing mortal ears should ever be exposed to. And once again, everything went white. The steam room tragedy. The sound of escaping steam was the last I expected to hear on a retired aircraft carrier. But there it was, a soft, persistent whisper that seemed to be calling to me further into the heart of the USS Hornet. I'd come on a lark, drawn by rumors of ghosts and the excitement of a mystery. But standing there listening, hearing that odd noise, I began to question whether I should have come. The tour party had long since moved on, their excited chatter fading in the distance. I comforted myself that I was merely stopping to take in the ambiance, to actually feel the history of this floating behemoth. But I knew better. Deep within, I waited for something more. Something unexplainable. I edged one step nearer the source of the sound, my footsteps echoing hollow in the empty corridor. The atmosphere grew thicker, weighing heavier with each pace, as though the air itself were trying to push me away. But curiosity drove me on, through rusting pipes and frayed warning signs, until I faced an innocuous-looking door. Steam room, the faded sign used to read above it. My fingers lingered over the handle, quivering ever so slightly. This was it, the fabled steam room, where, according to legend, a sailor had died many years ago, unaware that he had done so. His ghost was reputed to still haunt these corridors, forever trapped in a cycle of reporting for duty. I steeled myself and opened the door. The deluge of hot, wet air hit me like a physical force, nearly shoving me back. Strands of steam encircled my ankles as I walked in, obscuring my vision and making breathing difficult. The hissing grew louder, nearing a deafening roar in the small space. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I was able to see the faint silhouettes of lockers and benches against the walls. Everything was covered with a thin layer of moisture, which made the room look ghostly. It was the figure on one of the benches who froze the blood in my veins. At first glance, he looked like any other sailor, young, fit, dressed in a crisp white uniform. But as I looked closer, I realized something was terribly wrong. His edges seemed to blur and shift, as if he wasn't quite solid. And his eyes, they stared straight ahead, unseeing and empty. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything at all, except just sit there stiff with terror. But my body refused to obey. Instead, I waited with morbid fascination as the sailor slowly rotated his head toward me. "Time for my turn," he said, his voice awed inside the sweltering room. "Got to keep those engines purring smooth." He stood up, his movements smooth to the point of unnaturalness, and my skin crawled. He walked away from me to the door, and I caught a glimpse of his face, and nearly threw up. Instead of skin, there was nothing but red muscle and sinew, like his flesh had been boiled from his bones. The moment he crossed the threshold, vanishing from sight down the passage beyond, the magic was broken. I reeled back, struggling to draw air that was not thick with steam and the stench of decay. My mind reeled, trying to take in what I had just witnessed. It took every bit of courage that I possessed to step back out into the corridor. To my relief, it was empty. No ghostly sailor or anyone else to be seen. But the sense of being watched persisted, sending shivers down my spine despite the lingering heat of the steam room. I headed back out towards the main deck, trying to wipe the incident aside as mere fantasy fostered by ghost tales and the eerie atmosphere of the vessel. By the time I reached the hectic activity of the museum section, I had almost convinced myself that it was not anything more than a figment of my imagination. Almost. That night, in bed in my small apartment far from the Hornet, couldn't shake out of my mind the look of those empty eyes and that broken face. I couldn't sleep, but stretched and tossed as steam hissed through fancied pipes in my head. When I finally did sleep through until morning, I had a dream about endless corridors and the distant noise of footsteps which never seemed more than around the bend. I was wrenched awake, dripping in perspiration and twisted in my bedclothes. For days to follow, I tried to shake the experience. I threw myself into work, into socializing with friends, anything to keep my mind off of it. Nothing seemed to keep at bay the feeling that something had followed me home from that ship. It started small to begin with. Things not exactly where I'd left them. Smell of seawater on my landlocked flat. Then there were the noises, distant whispers just out of hearing, the groan of floorboards when I was alone in the house. A week later, when I went to the Hornet, I woke up in the middle of the night to find my bathroom full of steam. The mirror was fogged over, and through the mist had been scrawled 2 words: "Help me." Panic overwhelmed me at the time. I leapt from bed, hastily dressed, and ran out of my apartment without even considering the need to lock the door when I left. I drove indiscriminately along the early morning streets, my mind racing in the same proportions as my heartbeat. For no particular reason, I found myself once more at the naval base, where the Hornet lay moored. The enormous vessel loomed above me, its black form contrasting with the brightening horizon. Without knowing precisely why, I climbed the gangway and onto the deserted deck. The ship was another in the stillness of early morning, alive somehow. Every creak and groan seemed intentional, as if the Hornet itself were trying to communicate. I wandered through the corridors in a daze, my feet drawn inexorably back to that doomed steam room. This time, when I pushed open the door, no blast of steam or heat escaped. The room was cold and dark, lit only by the gentle glow of emergency lighting. But he was there, the sailor, sitting on the same bench as last time. "You came back," he said, his voice stronger now that the hiss of steam was not there to drown it out. "I knew you would. What do you desire from me?" I demanded, shocked at the evenness of my voice under the fear screaming through me. He stood up, his body formulating itself as he drew closer. "To remember," he said emotionlessly, "to be remembered." And then he told me his story, a story of duty and sacrifice, of a fatal wreck on a routine maintenance check that had taken hours to find. They had found him too late, but something had kept him to this building, refusing to let go. As he finished speaking, I had this weird sense of peace settle over me. This terror that had held me enthralled for days vanished, only to be replaced by a pure sadness for this lost soul. "Can you help me?" I asked once he'd finished speaking. "Is there something you can do to help you find peace?" He smiled afterwards, a genuine smile that transformed his pitted face into something almost handsome. "You already do," he breathed, "by listening, by remembering." And with that, he began to fade like fog in the sun. But before he vanished completely, he reached across and brushed his fingers against my hand. The contact was only for a moment, but it left a lingering heat that seeped into my entire body. As the sun rose over the ship, its deck lay long in shadow, I made landfall, feeling lighter than I had in years. Behind me still lingered the Hornet, but its terror and specter were removed. It now loomed as a reminder of those who had lived and perished aboard its steel bulk, lives that had to be remembered. I thought that would be the end of it, that by hearing his story and promising to remember, I had somehow laid his ghost to rest. But as I climbed into my car to head home, I caught sight of myself in the rearview mirror. My eyes widened with horror as I realized what I was seeing. There, hidden just beneath the surface of my skin, was a network of red, irate lines, like slow-healing steam burns, and watched in horror as they began to spread. The truth hit me with shattering clarity. I hadn't freed him at all. Instead, I had taken his place, become the new keeper of the steam room's tragic history. Now it was my turn to wait in that limbo space between life and death, hoping someone would come along and listen to my story. And as the panic came back once more, I heard him talk to me one last time, a breath on the wind carrying a blood-freezing oath. "Welcome aboard, sailor. Your watch starts now."
Thanks for joining us in the shadows tonight. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories every week. Have you got a story of your own? Share it in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And remember, the darkness holds many secrets. Are you brave enough to uncover them? Until next time, keep your lights on and your doors locked. Sweet nightmares.